So welcome everybody. We will go ahead and jump in to a few pieces to get us started as others are joining, but it's really helpful when we're talking about systems and um, data and all things PBIS if we kind of can relate to your location. So if you don't care, go ahead and go up to the three dots that are on the right side of your Zoom screen. And just let us know what district. So leave your name on there, but I see Chris Rush in the top right of my screen. So like she would just do Chris Rush dash Perry. So we would know what district. That's helpful as we get started. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and make sure that shares correctly. Great. So we will be asking you to use your chat feature a little bit today. We're only together an hour, so it's a pretty short amount of time. But as we talk through things, we're not going to do any breakout rooms during this hour, but we might ask you to drop questions or thoughts in the chat. So if you are not in a car and not driving, be prepared to drop some things in the chat. And if you are, please be safe and don't drop anything in the chat. So we will go ahead and jump in. So when we start thinking about tier 2 and tier 3, we really start talking about and thinking about behavior and behavioral health interventions. And so when we talk about behavioral health, we really are talking about how are we addressing the mental health needs of our students, and sometimes even of our staff, or bringing in families when we start talking about that collaboration across settings. So when we think about tier 2, tier 3, one of the pieces that we really have to ensure is in place to begin with is tier 1. So I'm going to talk a little bit about tier 1 today so that we can think about what we have in place, maybe what we're missing, because we oftentimes think about academic instruction. We think about reading and teaching kids to read. We think about math and teaching kids how to do math and different strategies and ways to do math. But when it comes to behavior, we don't always think about teaching the behavior. We don't always think about the instruction that goes along with that. We think about consequences. And so that's one of the reasons that we want to put PBIS in place, because it really does focus on the positive behavioral supports. How are we teaching? How are we modeling things for students? And then how are we acknowledging students when they exhibit that appropriate behavior? So I'm going to stop just a second. And I am going to let you guys look at the screen and just drop a couple thoughts in the chat. We all know who that is. So tell me, why do I have Smokey the Bear on the screen? And I have a lot of different Smokey the Bears on the screen. So why do I have that up there? Why is that so critical and so important? We start talking about behavior, behavioral health, and thinking about intervention. Some of you that are on are familiar with this, and you've heard me talk about it before, but when we start really thinking about behavior, we have to think about preventing the behavior. Many of you are in administrative roles or school counselors or even district administrators that are on today. And so I know that oftentimes you feel like a firefighter on a daily basis. You are putting out fires, whether it be in classrooms, in the hallway, in the cafeteria, or even in the front office. And so instead of thinking about how can we be a firefighter and walking around with our masks on all the time and our water hose, we really want to think about that Smokey the Bear lens. How can we prevent the forest fire before it starts? We know that it's going to be less expensive. It's going to be less taxing and exhausting on us and our teachers and our systems in schools. So as we go throughout this entire series that we're going to talk about intervention, I want you to be thinking about prevention. So when we talk about intervention, even when students' data shows us that they need some type of evidence-based intervention, we still are preventing them from needing something further. So just keep Smokey the Bear in mind, because I will continue to talk about him. So this is kind of our learning series outline. We are together today. We're really going to talk about Tier 1, some screening and fidelity measures. We also are together in September, October, November, and December. And so when we start into September, we're going to really jump into behavior. Once we get to October, we're going to talk about behavioral health. And so what does that look like? Who is licensed and qualified in our schools and in our buildings to provide some of our evidence-based interventions around mental health for students? Oftentimes, as a school counselor, our school counselors may think, I'm not really qualified to do that, but there are evidence-based strategies and programs that we can use with our school counselors, even our teachers in our buildings. And so we're going to talk about some of those high effect size strategies and programs. We will be talking about both of those for those of you that are wondering. And then we also, once we get into November, want to start thinking about connecting the dots. And so, how do all of the different interventions and pieces work together when we start thinking about progress monitoring and working with outside agencies? Which, based on the districts that I'm seeing, I know all of you all are working in some capacity with outside agencies to provide some behavioral health clinical supports for students. And so, how do all those pieces really fit together? So, one of the things I think that we oftentimes think about is we want to know, and I think in education, we all do this. We say, tell me what to do. I want to know exactly what to do and how to do it and when to do it. And so, what you see on the screen right now is kind of like the ultimate end goal, right? And so, we want to know what is our tier 2 criteria, how many students are in there, what does that look like, who's going to be progress monitoring, and what is the actual intervention. The same thing for tier 3. But in order to get to this, it's going to be a little bit of a process. So I want you to think about this. This is really the end goal. So when we start thinking about what does this look like in practice in our schools and in our classrooms, in order to get to the place where we have all of our things in writing, where we know the process, whether it's a referral process out, whether it's a transition plan and process back into our buildings after students have been maybe in a residential facility or hospitalization, we have to start at the basis. And really, when we think about basis, we're talking about tier 1, that foundational layer. So I'm going to give you about 30 seconds. The question says, what does the perfect district or school look like? So I want you to think about behavior. You can think about social skills. You can think about emotional regulation or competencies. You can think about mental health support. So if you were to walk in the perfect school or district, what do you think it would look like? And drop that in the chat.
Getting some great responses, Megan.
Great, Mary. Go ahead and share with us a few.
Okay, it's personalized for the population and needs of that school or district, support for all staff and students, care and compassion for everyone being on the same page and understanding each other's wants and needs, safe, family-like setting with support and caring, the love for all kids, all hands on deck, culture, climate of inclusion and positive systems, a school that values emotional stability, resilience, and social support and makes it a priority for all students. Caring for all students and staff, a place where students and staff feel safe and respected.
Okay, Mary, I'm going to jump in. You don't have to read all of them. I'm sorry.
Okay, that's
But
okay.
I love the answers that we're getting and that we're seeing. So when you think about what that perfect school or district looks like, many of you went first to what does the staff look like, right? And so what are the adults in the building actually doing? And so when we think about processes and systems with all things PBIS in all tiers, it's first starts with the adults. Adult behavior matters. The things that we do and model in our school settings matter tremendously, and we have lots of research to support that. So I love that you all are thinking about that and focused on that. What would students look like in our buildings? If we had the perfect school or district, what would the students look like? What would they be doing? Drop those in the chat. I see a few of them already. Kids, teachers, happy to be at school. Students feel respected. Students would be learning. I love that. Active engagement. Sure, absolutely. So we've thought about what the adults would be doing and what the adults look like. You've also thought about what students would look like and what students would be doing. Now, the next question I have for you is, what does your school look like today? And I want you to specifically think about the students. So if someone were to walk in your building today that didn't know any staff members and any students, what would that look like today? Or at the beginning of this year, as we started the year, what would that look like? Students would be engaged. Mary, you may be seeing some others that I'm not.
It goes a student's happy, feeling loved, safe, and learning. Students wanting to be at school.
Yes, I love that. Yes, absolutely.
Having friends, comfortable.
Okay, so that's what we may see today. Now, I want you to think about the reason you're here. I want you to think about your why for just 1 second, okay? So when you think about your why, you have some students somewhere that is the reason you want to know and learn more about these tier 2 and tier 3 interventions. So I want you to think about the students who you may call them your high flyers. You may call them your students on fire. You may call them your frequent office visitors. What would those students be doing and look like that's different from what we've talked about?
We've got a couple of things in the chat. Just I'll let you know, struggling to find time for RTI, staff who need extra help, teachers who want to help but don't always have time. And
Sure,
another,
absolutely.
I'm here to learn more strategies to help our students, the students that are most at risk. And then another is off task, not engaged.
So I think that we're early in the school year, but I say maybe 3 or 4 more weeks, and we'll probably be seeing a lot of the things that Mary has just mentioned. We're going to be seeing students who aren't engaged as we wish they were. We may be seeing students who are tired and don't want to be at school. We may be seeing those behaviors start to present that we didn't see, week 1 of school. So we know that there are students that are still struggling. We know that those kids are probably the reason that many of you are here today to learn where do we start with those kids, right? And sometimes those kids have complex needs, and there are so many needs in our buildings right now. We all know that where do we start with the whole school? Where do we start with one grade level? And then where do we start with one student? So hopefully those are some of the things that we're going to get out of this learning series when we start thinking about where to start, because that's a question that we get oftentimes is we have so many behaviors, we don't know where to start, we don't know what to do first, because it seems like every time we turn around there's a new issue or a new behavior or a new student. So thank you all for sharing that. Okay, my graphic is not showing up, but real quickly, let's just talk about when we think about behavior, we're relating it back to MTSS. And so we think about that overall structure of our multi-tiered system of support. We know that the purpose of that is to integrate that social, emotional, behavioral competency through academic instruction and intervention. And so we are thinking about the whole child. We're looking at everything holistically. Again, we know we should be providing a continuum of supports, and we are focused on prevention, focused on Smokey the Bear. We know our 6 essential elements of MTSS, but when it comes to intervention, sometimes we don't think about those immediately. And so one of the things that I want you to start thinking about is with intervention in tier 2 and tier 3 for behavior and mental health, are we looking at all of our elements that are part of our overall framework? So if we're talking about a tier 2 intervention or a tier 3 intervention, it could be with an individual student or a group of students. Are we ensuring that everyone equally has the opportunity to participate in an intervention when the data shows? Do we have a problem-solving team that's meeting and talking about these individual interventions and students and looking at that data? Are we collecting the right data to look at and make decisions around? Are we ensuring that we're utilizing evidence-based supports? And then are we including the family or some type of support wraparound system with those students? And we'll talk a little bit about that in one of the future series, but that family school support, oftentimes we know that students have behaviors or behavior challenges or mental health challenges because of something that is lacking within that family structure. And so when we have those students who don't have those supports and don't have that family structure, then what are the things that we can do to provide those wraparound services for those students and with them? So there's our triangle. You all know that we cannot have any type of training without thinking about those tiers in that triangle. I'm going to put the definition of PBIS up here really quickly, and I want you to look at what's highlighted. So evidence-based, 3-tiered, and preventative. So when we start talking about the interventions, I really want you to think about, are they evidence-based? Is what we're doing evidence-based? And we're not going to spend a whole lot of time talking or learning about EBPs, but with evidence-based practices, a couple of the things that you have to think about are we providing, number one, an intervention that is evidence-based? And number two, are we providing this intervention as it was designed? So if we have an intervention that says it takes 30 minutes 3 times a week, and our intervention block or our intervention time is 15 to 20 minutes 3 times a week, then there's no possible way that we can provide that intervention with fidelity. And so that is critical when we're thinking about interventions and looking at data for individual students as well as whole school. We have to choose EBPs that are appropriate for our student population, and we have to make sure that we have the correct time and sessions per week, or whatever that structure was. Interventions have to be delivered as they were designed. So that's one of the pieces that we see oftentimes schools and districts struggle with, and it's really a barrier to student supports, is that we either don't have enough time allotted for these evidence-based interventions, or we're not providing the intervention as it was designed in any capacity. Now, when we are implementing PBIS with fidelity, and I mean PBIS in Tier 1, in Tier 2, and in Tier 3, we have a decrease of the things that you see on your screen. So of disciplinary actions, inappropriate social behavior, substance abuse, aggressive behaviors, bullying behaviors, and teacher turnover. I want you all to drop in the chat which one of those things do you think would be most beneficial to wherever you are in your school setting? Which one of those would be most beneficial to you? Would you rather see a decrease in disciplinary actions? Would you rather see a decrease in bullying, or an increase in teacher retention, which we know is an issue everywhere?
We have bullying behavior in the chat.
Okay.
A couple have dropped that in the chat. Bullying, inappropriate social behavior, teacher turnover. Inappropriate social behavior and teacher turnover.
So I think that everyone on our call today would agree that all of these things are important. Some may be more important than others based on your setting, whether you're elementary, middle school, high school, or just your school individually, wherever you are. But all of these things, when we look at what the evidence tells us are outcomes of implementing in Tier 1, Tier 2, Tier 3, all of these things are things that we want and we talk about on a daily basis. And so we have to think about implementing those things with fidelity, really, in order to improve our systems and our schools. So you will see that I have the 3 triangles separate on the screen. And so one of the things when we're talking about PBIS with these interventions is we need to make sure the interventions are layered. And so what do I mean by layered? You see that green triangle goes all the way to the very tip top. And so when we start thinking about Tier 2, those Tier 2 interventions are layered on top of Tier 1. So if we were to go back, we could go back and say, are we truly implementing Tier 1? If the answer to that is yes, then we move to Tier 2. Are we truly implementing and layering Tier 2 supports? And then are we implementing those interventions as designed in Tier 3? So I really want you to start thinking about those things as layered supports, okay? So as we know, MTSS is that umbrella that overarches everything, academic and behavior and mental health. And then we have to start really focusing in on that right side, which really is our school mental health framework. And so I'm going to pause just a second, and I want you to be thinking about that school mental health framework. And so really some of the pieces of that, we have to think about behavior with positive behavior supports and teaching those. We know that part of our Kentucky legislation, the School Safety and Resiliency Act, talks about those trauma-informed practices and how we have to implement those in classrooms. Social skills and emotional competencies, that's your SEL. And many of you have heard me talk about that magic wand that everybody thinks SEL is, that it isn't. It's great to teach kids social skills, but we've been teaching those social skills for hundreds of years and teaching them emotional regulation. And then that mental health and school safety. And so when we think about those like this, we really have to think about what are the pieces and parts when we're talking about this system and supporting kids that are a part of behavior or behavioral health interventions. And so I'm going to pause just a second and let you kind of look at those pieces. that are part of the framework, and think about it. This is the question I want you to think about is, do you in your setting as an administrator, as a counselor, as a teacher, wherever you are, do you think about all of these pieces as a framework and structured together? Because oftentimes, and what we see all over the place, is that we're thinking of these things separately. We're thinking of them almost in silos. So I'm going to give you just a second to reflect on that. What do you think about these pieces of that behavioral health and behavior framework? Do we think of them together, or are we still looking at them separately? You can drop any questions in the chat or any thoughts, but I just want you to think about these pieces for just a minute. This is really important moving forward. So what do we think? Do we think about these things together or separately? Drop that in the chat. Together or separate in your role and your setting? Notice that everything that you see on the screen that has an asterisk next to it is part of a Kentucky regulation. So all of those things are law that we have to implement.
A lot are saying together, and one put in the chat. I know they need to be thought of together, but we often approach them separately. But everybody's putting together is what's being shared in the chat.
That is fabulous. I think that this has taken a long time for us to start thinking about these together. And I will tell you that a lot of our classroom teachers are still thinking of them separately. They don't see how the puzzle pieces connect. They don't see how the safety and bully prevention or suicide prevention support PBIS, or PBIS supports those. So I think that that's one of the things, whatever role that you are in, that's going to be helpful to start thinking about is making sure that we are connecting the dots for everybody that's involved in supporting students. Do our bus drivers understand? Do our paraeducators understand how all of these things work together? Because oftentimes what we see is the behavior. We know behavior is communication. So we see the behavior presents in our school settings. So if we're truly thinking about all of these things together, our immediate thought should be not what's wrong with you, but what happened to you, and then what can I do to support you? And unfortunately, based on our state data, through YRBS, through our KIP surveys, and through Infinite Campus, our data tells us that we still in the state of Kentucky have mostly reactionary and punitive consequences in place for discipline for students. And so with all things PBIS, yes, students need consequences, but are the consequences appropriate? And are they responsive, or are they proactive intervention responses where we're teaching students other ways to behave? So I hope that we are starting to think about those together, but I will tell you that our data is not supporting that just yet. So we have to start thinking about these interventions for behavior and mental health the exact same way that we think about academic intervention. So number one, foundational layer, all students should be receiving that tier 1 instruction on a daily basis. So making sure that every student is getting the same thing. That also goes back to equity. Then when we think about tier 2, are we utilizing data to provide evidence-based interventions to some students? So if we are using data, and we're going to talk about that in just a minute, what data are we using? Is it in writing? And is everyone aware? Are we using data consistently? And do we have data decision rules? And then when we think about that tier 3, it should be our most intense layer, and it should be just a few students that are being provided those evidence-based interventions for behavior and mental health. Now, I want you to think about this. We know post-COVID, we know our data is supporting everywhere we are having a mental health crisis with students, and oftentimes with staff as well. So when we think about the crisis situation that we are all in as a whole, and we think about those intensive interventions, which a lot of you may be thinking about, a service provider, agencies that push into your buildings, or clinicians that provide therapeutic services for tier 3, one of the things we are seeing everywhere is that we are actually missing tier 2. And so we are seeing that students are receiving maybe PBIS in tier 1, Not a lot going on in tier 2, but we immediately want to jump to that tier 3. They need a referral to an outside agency. And so while our outside agencies are necessary and valuable, we also know like there's a teacher shortage, there's also a clinician shortage. And so we have to make sure that in tier 2, when we think about that, are we as a school providing those students everything that we can possibly provide them before we send them out to an outside agency or wraparound? And I know that we still have a lot of districts that don't have school counselors in every building and don't have support personnel. But that's one of the things that our data is supporting that we really need to focus on is tier 2. So I'm going to stop for just a second, and I want you to think about what that looks like in your setting, whether it's a district level or a school level. Do we think that we are providing appropriate tier 2 interventions, or do we oftentimes jump to tier 3? So I'm going to give you just a second to reflect on that and drop something in the chat. Are we focused on tier 2 and providing what supports we can at the school level, or do we jump to that referral?
Focused on tier 2, both, often jump to tier 3. Focused on tier 2, tier 2. Kind of seeing a little bit of both being in the chat there, Megan.
Okay, great. So I think that's something that's going to look a little bit different in every building. Every district's going to look different, but even 4 buildings in one district are going to look different. So that's something that I want you all just to be thinking about and reflecting on as we go throughout the series is this something that we are doing, or do we jump immediately to something on fire? Because that's one of the things we're seeing, and that's one of the reasons that our clinicians are overwhelmed and are not able to provide all the needs, to meet all the needs that we're seeing in our districts and our schools. So just making sure we have something in place at tier 2 is going to be really important. Now, we're going to think about tier 1 as well for just a second. And so I want you to think about some of those evidence-based strategies or evidence-based practices for teachers to utilize in classrooms. And so think about this. Take just a second and think, do my teachers in my building know and understand what are the evidence-based strategies for dealing with challenging behavior or students who are presenting some type of inappropriate behavior in classrooms on a daily basis? We know that we have tons of new teachers. We have teachers that are coming out of non-traditional teacher education programs, whether it be an option, I don't know, well, no, we have 6, I know we have 9, we have lots of different option programs. We also have MAT teachers. We have teachers that are enrolled in some alternative pathway programs as well at universities. And so think about all of those teachers that are coming into our schools or districts that are brand new. They're trying to learn how to teach. They're trying to learn, what does classroom management look like? So oftentimes they're very overwhelmed. And one of the things that we have seen over the past probably 2 years, I think, is our teachers that were really strong with providing those interventions in tier 1 for behavior. A lot of that is changing. And so our newer teachers are not as strong. They don't know what these interventions are. If they've heard of them, they may not know how to implement them. So what does this look like in your setting? What does this look like in your school? Do you think your teachers are implementing these tier 1 strategies in classrooms? Is the question. Do we think our teachers are implementing these tier 1 strategies in classrooms?
Older, yes. Newer, no. Most do, maybe not newer teachers.
So one of the things that I think is important for us to think about in whatever role you're in, if you're in a leadership role, if you are a school counselor, if you're an administrator, is thinking about these strategies that should be utilized in classrooms with all students, especially your students with challenging behaviors, And do our teachers know how to implement them? And we've seen a lot, we've had a lot of increased requests for, we just need some basic classroom management strategies. We need some support with our newer teachers, how to deal with students. The other thing that we are hearing that I want you to think about is even our teachers who are experienced, maybe they've been teaching 20 years or 25 years and they know how to do these strategies or they're implementing these strategies. Kids' behavior may be escalating. So they may be seeing some behaviors they haven't seen before, or they're definitely heightened behaviors and mental health needs. And so it's really hard when you are the classroom teacher, even if you know these strategies, the behaviors sometimes are extreme enough that we, as the classroom teacher who should be in charge of that learning environment, go to that panic mode or that flight fight response mode sometimes. And so it's hard to pull these out and utilize them all the time. So I want you just to be thinking about that in whatever role you are in, something to think about for your setting. So we know that effective instruction is going to be important. Many of you have heard me talk about this before, but that 4-to-1 ratio of positive to negative reinforcement versus consequences and punishment, we know that that 4-to-1 ratio is not what we should be doing right now. It really looks more like 10-to-1. And so while 4-to-1 is great and it is a goal, 10-to-1 is really what the research is indicating students need in order to feel successful and be intrinsically motivated in our settings. So think about how difficult that is with your students with challenging behavior. It is very hard for us to do. So think about that. What does that look like? The most recent data in the state of Kentucky, I'm going to let you all guess. What do you think the data looks like for that positive and negative ratio average across the state from 20? So it was really some 2021 data that was taken from 2017 to 2019. So what do you think the ratio is, the average ratio? Average ratio. What do you think? Any thoughts on that? Those of you that are in administrators and in classrooms every day, take a guess.
One to three.
Okay.
I'm thinking 2-to-1 or 1-to-1.
So our elementary was a little bit better than middle school, high school, but elementary average really is 2-to-1. And so that tells us that that is that 2 positives for every 1 negative is what that tells us. Our middle school, high school was the exact opposite. So our middle school, high school was 2 negatives to every positive. And so that ratio is pretty far from that 10-to-1. So when we think about that, in order to be able to provide those ratios, we have to set our students up to be successful. And in order to do that, we have to put these systems for prevention in place. So I think that's pretty interesting to think about what those averages are. So when we think about tier 1 and thinking about that fidelity piece, I'm going to go back to fidelity. You all, many of you have seen this tier 1 checklist, but do we have all of the pieces and parts of tier 1 in place? Is tier 1 in place with fidelity? So are all these things in place? And when I say that, I don't necessarily mean, are there posters on the wall? I mean, if I walk in schools and I talk to kids and I talk to teachers, are they able to speak the language? Do they say, here at such and such elementary, we do X, Y, and Z. We are respectful, responsible, and safe. And this is what it looks like in the cafeteria, and this is what it looks like in the hallway. Are our teachers able to use that language? You know, when you go into a school to do a walkthrough and you're like, oh, talk to me about behavior supports here. What does behavior look like? Do you all have PBIS? You all would be shocked at the number of schools that think they're doing a fabulous job with PBIS. And there's a teacher that we talk to and they go, I don't know what PBIS is. Okay, well, PBIS is our expectations. I see your posters up on the wall. You know, they put those posters up about 3 years ago, but we don't really do anything with them. And so when we start thinking about PBIS and that tier 1 fidelity, that tier 1 has to be in place with fidelity before we can look at accurate data to determine which students need that tier 2 and tier 3. And so oftentimes it's going back kind of to square one and saying what is in place, what is not in place. So I see we have Morgan County, I've seen some Floyd, I've seen Letcher, Pike County. So I want you all to think about and reflect on, do you think tier 1 is in place in your school, in your district? Is tier 1 in place with Fidelity? And the question really is, if you say yes, then how do you know? What data set are you looking at to determine and be able to say, yes, we are implementing with Fidelity? So I'm going to pause just a second and let you all think about that. And I want you to remember, when you start implementing positive behavior supports, typically takes 3 to 5 years for that to be in place with Fidelity. So what do we think?
Yes. In the chat.
Lots of yeses, Mary?
Some haven't got to it yet, but what we
Okay,
have
so I
got.
want you, okay, great. So I want you to be thinking about that. If you think yes, have you gone through that tiered fidelity inventory with your, well, I've missed a slide. Hang on. Have you gone through that tiered fidelity inventory with your team? What does that look like? Do you have an action plan? Do you know what you need to be working on? So what does that look like right now for you? That's one of the pieces that's really important before we start thinking about tier 2.
Honestly, no. Like you said, we have all in place, but being consistent is lacking.
Whoever said that, absolutely. We see that everywhere. And so it's oftentimes really strong when we start the year, and then as the year goes on, student behavior becomes more challenging. We get tired. It's easy to forget teaching those expectations or reinforcing. And so that's one of the pieces oftentimes that we see as a need in districts and in schools. We have some of the pieces and parts, maybe not all of them, but we aren't actually implementing. And so that implementation piece is key with tier 1. Are we really implementing? So super important. Mary, we're going to move on just for time's sake, if that's okay.
That's fine.
So thinking about in the classroom, and we're not going to discuss, just want you again to think about it, aligning all of the pieces. So PBIS, are we implementing with Fidelity, is question 1, but the second question is, does everybody in our school think of aligning these initiatives? That SEL, our trauma-informed practices. Do we know what's in our trauma plan? Every district is required to have a trauma plan. Do we know what that plan says that we're going to be doing? Have we talked about suicide prevention and not thought of it as a checkbox before September 15th? You know, that suicide prevention is key. And I think that a lot of schools and a lot of districts, we show a video, we talk about it for 10 minutes, we check that box and we move on. But we know that just because we've talked about it before September 15th of this school year doesn't mean that there aren't students down the road in November, December, January, February that are going to have some suicide ideation. And so how are we addressing those things? Many of you earlier talked about bully prevention. That's one of the things that you are seeing as a problem. And so this should also align with whatever we're doing with that, as well as our threat assessment and risk assessment teams, and providing some mental health literacy training for our teachers. So all of these things really should be aligned. So now let's jump into data and talk about these data systems that drive decisions. And so I don't know about you all, but I will tell you that 100 years ago, I was a school counselor. And I can tell you how I knew when a student needed intervention. And some of you have heard me say this, but it's when the teacher called and said, Megan, come get him right now. And I don't want him back in my classroom, right? Or you have to do something. So when we think about intervention today, we have so many data sets. We are oftentimes data rich and implementation poor. We have to start thinking about how are we using the data we have to drive decisions for tier 2 and tier 3 students and intervention wise. So we have to start thinking about the systems that are in place. So I want you to think about your tier 1 system just a second. Do you have in your setting a tier 1 system of some sort where you are consistently tracking and looking at the data of office discipline referrals. Are you looking at your Tableau reports? Do you have a universal behavior or behavioral health screener? And there is a difference. Do you have one of those in place? When we think about a universal screener, universal screeners are an assessment or a tool used with all students in a particular group. And so we get questions a lot around universal screeners because we have to think about now also some of our legislation that's in place specifically for those mental health screeners. If we say we're going to give a screener and that's the data that's going to drive which students get intervention, but only 40% of our students bring back a permission slip that says they can actually take the assessment or the screener, that data is not equitable. So yes, we can use that data, but what about those students who didn't take that assessment or who we are not using that tool with? And so we really have to be thinking about what's this going to look like in our setting? What's it going to look like for my district, or what's it going to look like for my school? Because those things are important in moving forward with interventions. Infinite Campus, again, a requirement for all schools to be implementing behavior within Infinite Campus. How are you documenting things like risk assessments and threat assessments? Because those things are more on that mental health side, and they should not be put in as something that needs a discipline action. So when you think about a risk assessment, we still have some districts and schools that say, yeah, we put those into Infinite Campus. Well, what's the behavior that you put those under? Because those really are things a student is following what we've taught them, asking for support or help for mental health. We should not be documenting those things as something that needs a referral, something that needs a disciplinary action. And that's the purpose of IC. So just some things to be thinking about. And then do we have criteria? So if we are looking at a screener, do we have a cut score? Do we have a percentage? Do we have a percentile? If we are looking at something like Infinite Campus, we know Infinite Campus really is not going to get to our internalizing behaviors. It probably is going to capture externalizing. But what is our criteria for that? And then we have to think, is that equitable? If we're looking at IC and we know it's not capturing the internalizing behavior, is that equitable for all students? So just some things to think about. How many of you all are actually utilizing Tableau at this time? Just a yes or a no. Utilizing these Tableau reports. How many of you all have seen these? Look at them on a regular basis?
Getting some yeses.
Great.
3 of them.
I don't know how many we have on right now, but I hope there's more than 3. But I will tell you that Tableau is not super easy to use when you begin using it. So if you are a school administrator or school counselor, I really would encourage you to dig into Tableau. There is a user guide that will be linked in the folder, but dig into Tableau, look at your data, see what the data is telling you, make sure it's correct, make sure that your resolutions are in there, make sure that your student data is correct. So all of these things are really important when we start talking about making decisions. So again, this platform is called Tableau, and it is an add-on platform to Infinite Campus through the Department of Education. So every school and every district in the state of Kentucky can get access to this. If you are someone that doesn't have access, start with your IC administrator at the district level. And I know Bernadette and Brana are on, and they are experts in Tableau, and I'm sure that they can help you and support if that's something that you are needing as well.
We do have one that we have like over 30 people in the meeting, and just a few have said yes, and one said their district isn't giving them access because some of them are limiting it, aren't they?
That's interesting. Okay. There are district reports and there are school reports. There are also individual student reports. It has all of these filters that you can see over here on the right-hand side. And there are a million reports, and they are great data. But if you are in a leadership role, whether it be at the school level or district level, I really would encourage you to look at the top 5 reports, top 3 to 5, really, that you all want to concentrate and look at, and then dig into that data on a monthly basis, on an ongoing basis. If you pull up a different report every month when you're meeting, then your discussion is going to kind of be all over the place. So focus in on 3 to 5 reports and look at those same reports consistently over a span of 6 to 8 months, and you really will see what this data looks like and how it can help you with decision making at the school level. A few other. It also is great if we have any special education teachers on right now. It's great because you can see all of your students, what that looks like for suspension, out of instructional days and minutes, and those pieces. Brana or Bernadette, you all want to jump in and say anything about Tableau?
There's all kinds of information on there if you just go through that, and I can give you but you have to have access. But if you're looking at the equity dashboard, you go through Tableau and it breaks it on down specifically in certain areas. And I have a real quick and easy guide, the directions to show you how to get into that. It's something though that your district has to give you permission to have access to it. I don't know. I wonder, I would think now, of course, it's totally a district decision, but I would think that every principal would need it and every counselor would need it. But I'll be happy, anybody that has any questions on it, I'd be happy to share, do a Zoom with you or come see you and help you. Brana, I know, would come right with me. So just let me know.
Thank you, Bernadette. And I think that that's exactly right. I think that the majority of districts across the state are giving administrators and school counselors access. Some are creating a generic login for the school and having them share one, but your classroom teachers probably don't need access to this. It's more school level data thinking about moving forward. So I want to stop for just a second and I want to think about these screeners and the data that you are using to determine which students receive a tier 2 or tier 3 intervention. So just stop for just a second. I'm actually going to stop sharing my screen and see where we are as far as time. Oh, good. We've got a few extra minutes. Let's talk about what data you're using to determine which students receive tier 2 and tier 3 interventions. That's the question. What data are you using? If you don't care, just to drop that in the chat and then let's kind of talk about what that looks like.
Can't hear Megan.
Megan.
We can't hear you.
Megan.
Sorry. So sorry. I didn't realize I had.
Okay. I went to the bathroom very quickly and then it was so quiet when I came back. I was like, what are we working on? I mean, I stepped out and went to the bathroom. I'm so sorry, but were you talking with your mic muted?
I was, yes. Can you all hear me?
Okay,
now?
that makes me feel better. Thank you, sweetheart.
Okay, Mary, can you all see the screen?
Yeah, you're good.
Yes.
I can see your screen.
Okay. So one of the questions that we have to answer moving forward, thinking about intervention, is what is the data we're utilizing to determine which students receive a tier 2 or tier 3 intervention? Okay. So that really is the question that I want you to be thinking about, is what data, and drop that in the chat, what data are we utilizing to determine which students receive a tier 2 or tier 3 intervention right now? What does that look like for us? Mary, anything in the chat you're seeing right now?
Universal screener like iReady is one. But no, not anything but that.
Okay. So when we start thinking about data for determining students in tier 2 receiving a behavior or a behavioral health intervention, I want us to be thinking about office discipline referrals, but also some type of additional data. So are we utilizing an evidence-based SEL screener or some type of behavioral screener that teachers are completing or students are completing? We have seen a lot of districts moving towards FastBridge. FastBridge has an evidence-based screener now for behavior and social skills and emotional competencies. We are seeing a lot of districts utilizing the DESA, which was used for years in the clinical world, and it is now being utilized by schools. We are still seeing lots of schools and districts utilize the student risk screening survey, internalizing and externalizing. So when we think about data, we have to have some type of data point to start with for choosing which students receive intervention. So that really is going to be step one, or 1A, 1B maybe, of choosing interventions for students for behavior and for mental health. So we have to think about behavior oftentimes presents as disruptive behavior. Students can't sit in their seat, or they're calling out, or they're not following directions. And so that's the behavior we're seeing. But we have to think about the function of that behavior, which is one of the pieces that we're going to start talking about the next time we're together, is what's the function of the behavior? And really, how do we know if this behavior is a behavior issue or an underlying mental health issue? And so one of the things I think is really important is that tier 1 data for those questions. And so, is this behavior presenting across school settings? Does it happen in all classrooms? Does it happen just in one teacher's classroom? We have to think about, does it occur on the bus? Is it in the cafeteria? Is it one setting? Is it multiple settings? So that's one of the questions we have to start thinking about, is where's the behavior occurring? And then what's the function? What's the purpose of the behavior? So those are some of the questions I want you all to kind of be thinking about as we move into the next part, which is going to be function of behavior, and what's the difference really between a behavior intervention and a behavioral health intervention. We know that many of our students need both. And so when we think about that, it may be presenting as disruptive behavior in classrooms, but maybe it's because of an underlying issue with anxiety. And so we can put a behavior intervention in place and probably eliminate some of the behavior we're seeing in classrooms, but we're not ever going to get to the root of the problem. We're not ever going to address the underlying problem until we address that anxiety with that student. So those are some things I want you all to be thinking about as we move into our next time together. And so I'm going to, again, stop sharing, Mary. I do have one thing I'm going to drop in the chat. This is a video, a YouTube video. It's about 10 minutes. I would love for you all to watch this video before the next time that we're all together. So this video is from CIBERS, the Center for Instructional and Behavioral Research in Schools, and it is a video of check in, check out. And so that's one of our evidence-based behavior interventions that layers perfectly with mental health interventions. So we're going to be talking about which interventions pair together, and which interventions are appropriate to use for which behaviors. Okay. So I'm going to drop that in the chat, and Mary, I'm going to turn it over to you. I know it's time for you to drop the evaluation in there. And then any other questions? The only other thing, Mary, is they will also have access to, number one, the PowerPoint, and number two, some additional resources in the folder for today. I don't know if you said that or not. So.
Perfect, Megan. Yes, you will be getting access to the participant folder. I'll be emailing that to everyone who's registered and been in the meetings and signed up. So once you signed up for one of the sessions, you're registered for all of them. So you don't have to register again. We'll be sending you the links and reminders of the meeting. The next meeting is September 20th. And so I will be sending a calendar invite, and it'll have the Zoom link in it for you as well. So that'll all be there for reminders. I am going to drop in the chat. Megan, did you drop in the chat yet your link? Because I will include that link in a reminder for homework for everybody. But I'm going to go ahead and drop in the chat the feedback survey. And you will be, when you complete that and hit submit, you will get an email from kvec.training. And it will have a copy of a certificate for ELA credit for 1 hour for you, so that you have that. And if you don't receive that, just let us know. And I will be sure and include this link that Megan has put in the chat for us in your next email. I'll send an email, and we'll send a copy I'll also drop a link to the participant folder. There's nothing in there just yet, but we will get it in there for you and get everything added, and that'll be the folder for our series. So let us know if you have any trouble accessing the feedback survey, but it should be emailing you a certificate as whenever you hit submit, and then be looking for an email for the next meeting. If there's anyone in your district that you want to recommend to sign up for the trainings, they can go to the KVEC PL calendar, or just go back to the email I sent that you all registered at and share that with them to be in future trainings, because I'll keep going back to that registration list. But thank you all so much for your time. And Megan, you did a fabulous job as always. Thank you so much for your time. Is there anything else, Megan, you need to say?
No, it was great to be with everybody. And starting with our next session together, we'll get into the nitty-gritty of the interventions, where to start, how to look at data, and progress monitoring. So intervention, be ready to get dirty next time we're together with those interventions. Yeah.